All right. Hello. Welcome to today's event on private thought and public speech. So I'm Gregory Conti from the politics department here, and I've just been deputized to introduce the others, so I'll keep my thoughts private otherwise and let them do the speaking. It's my pleasure to introduce two excellent speakers. The first is someone whom I've very long admired, so today is a great pleasure for me. I first encountered his work when I was reading his book on the writer William Hazlitt when I myself was an undergraduate English major a long time ago. And this is David Bromwich, who is Sterling Professor of English at Yale. Professor Bromwich's resume is so full and distinguished that one can only give brief snippets of it. Suffice to say that he has distinguished himself as a commentator on public affairs, in addition to being one of the leading scholars of modern English letters. Among his many excellent works of just the past decade are American Breakdown, the Trump Years and How They Befell Us, How Words Make Things Happen, The Intellectual Life of Edmund Burke, From the Sublime and Beautiful to American Independence, and The Moral Imagination. And he's going to open with some remarks, and then he'll enter into conversation with Princeton's own Flora Champy of the French and Italian department. Professor Champy is a scholar of literature and politics in the French Enlightenment, and the author, among other things, of L'Antiquité politique de Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the politics of the ancients, or political antiquity. How should I translate that in Rousseau? There we go. Okay. And I'll just say, lastly, that this event is hosted by the James Madison Program, and you can find out more about all of its events at their website, jmp.princeton.edu. And I've been told they also have a podcast as well, Madison's Notes. So you can check that out. So without any further ado, I'll turn the floor over to Professor Bromwich.
It's very good to be here and talking on this subject. Connected with free speech as a capacity or as a right, but also, I suppose, connected with conscience, consciousness, and education. When Professor Champy and Jonathan Jarafa asked me for a title of this talk, I knew that I wanted to address two practices that have spread throughout American society today: outrageous speech and censorship. Both practices are deleterious to a free society, and though they might seem contradictory, I believe each supports the other's claim to be necessary. My title, Private Thought and Public Speech, I hope I will have explained by the end of this talk. The tendencies themselves, however, are easy to describe. On the one hand, the unembarrassed publication of the degrading epithet, the intemperate accusation, the verbal assault against a person thought to be an erring member of one's own milieu. On the other hand, the bureaucratized penalizing of inappropriate speech, often classified as such quite recently, which has become common in the academic, media, professional, and corporate workplace. These phenomena in tandem are among the first things that strike a curious visitor to the United States in 2024, with reactions, in my experience anyway, that range from a condescending amusement to appalled disbelief. If it is asked how the action of brutal manners and the counteraction of puritanical morality can be at such cross purposes angrily in a society at peace, we get some part of a satisfying answer, I think, from the language of clinical psychology. The people addicted to slander and the people addicted to censorship are displaying at high visibility the symptoms of disinhibition. That may be a new word to one or two of you. I'm sure its meaning is immediately clear. When people feel themselves to be entirely at home with a crowd they're sure of, they can shed the instincts that are useful in enforcing a minimal self-censorship in mixed or uncertain company. At the same time, most of the company we keep is mixed and uncertain, and the heightened pressure to curb our speech in any sort of company that includes strangers may stifle the germ of fresh thoughts. You cheer or shout at the top of your voice the obvious sentiments that are shared in your group. Faced by a different and unknown group, you don't say aloud the thing you were half-minded to say, because you might suffer unpleasant consequences socially. If nonetheless your impulse to say it louder stays strong enough, you retreat to your group and there utter wilder words in a louder voice than you could have dared to use in public or before a broad public. This pattern of advance, hesitation, retreat, and expostulation in the smaller circle accounts for a lot of the trash talk in our current American discussions of political and social issues. I'll come back in a moment to the distemper in public life where so many arguments pass rapidly from vulgar declamation to sickly apology and back. But I have to take care to distinguish private thoughts, by which I mean thoughts prior to speech, from the confident espousal of a possibly brave opinion that comes to us without hesitation in our inside group. Thoughts are not just accidentally pre-verbal, and thoughts are not identical with whatever finds its way to expression. This fact, I think it is a fact, though English teachers aren't supposed to say it, this fact that thoughts are prior to, complex in a different way, and quite distinct from words, not quite distinct, sorry about that, one must not be dogmatic. This fact brings us up against an element of human nature that our researchers have evaded, and understandably, since the phenomenon is so elusive, namely the self-censorship of thought. Self-censorship of thought. The novelist E.M. Forster said, pretending to get the line from an old woman, but probably covering for himself, quote, "How do I know what I think till I see what I say?" You might take this, how do I know what I think till I see what I say? You might take it as an aesthetic defense of pure spontaneity and improvisation, a claim that our truest thoughts escape into words, as it were, inadvertently, and only then do we discover what we meant. I take Forster to have been saying something more complex. Our thoughts are never as predigested, never as accessible to framing or paraphrase, as the routines of the rhetorical and logical ordering of speech may tempt us to suppose. Often, our thoughts are still searching for their own identity, and words help them to find it. But even as words help, they also reduce. And we should never forget that words can only help. The first words out may be far from the completed thought. And is that thought ever, on a question of any profundity, quite complete? Wallace Stevens had this question in mind in his poem, The Motive for Metaphor, when he confessed an indefensible partiality for, and he's describing a mood now, and I'm about to quote, a partiality for the half colors of quarter things, the slightly brighter sky, the melting clouds, the single bird, the obscure moon. The obscure moon lighting an obscure world of things that would never be quite expressed, where you yourself were not quite yourself and did not want nor have to be. My talk will be suggesting that what is sketched there is an intuition about freedom. When you yourself were never quite yourself and did not want nor have to be. It's a not yet directed freedom. I hesitate to call it unconditioned, but Professor Champy will maybe cover that enlightenment point. The truth is that our breaking into speech comes to us covered with traces of the possible moods our thought has traversed on the way to speech, only one of which is the mood of decided meaning. Our private thoughts, as we begin to speak, can be a kind of dreaming aloud. We will translate those thoughts properly later on, but we begin by, say, muttering, maybe too audibly for our own good, and too loud for our own good. W.B. Yeats said that rhetoric is heard, poetry overheard, and it is possible that our dreaming aloud statements should be rated closer to poetry, at least in this narrow sense, that the affirmations they avow or imply don't yet want to be heard, only overheard. Just as Yeats was imagining the reader of genuine poetry to be a kindly eavesdropper, an overhearer, we may imagine the audience that overhears the, say, inchoate poetry of our dreaming aloud speech. We may imagine that hearer to be not unkindly disposed, not that is so hostile as to betray the private words by playing them into a megaphone and signing the speaker's name. The philosopher of language, W.V.O. Quine, expounded a principle he called charity in translation, according to which when confronted by an utterance that might be translated two ways, one of which makes it nonsense and the other sense, we should give the speaker credit for probably intending the version that makes sense. Charity. Something like this principle ought to apply in situations of expressive or persuasive speech, where the words may invite one of two responses. A, that it is a non-obnoxious opinion, vaguely or imperfectly formulated, or B, that it is a bigoted opinion, so poisonously unacceptable that its speaker deserves to suffer public humiliation and ostracism. In such an ambiguous context, charity in translation suggests that we favor the innocent version of the speaker's intention. Now, dreaming aloud, as I've called it, may be a stretched and fanciful description of how private thoughts make their way into a not yet answerable approximation of public speech. We can recognize anyway that many thoughts that eventuate in speech are in their essence experimental. We're testing the air, seeing what it sounds like when our friends are around, wondering how it strikes them, possibly, but not necessarily curious to know the way it would be received by bare acquaintances or strangers. Of course, this testing of our view will often present itself as anything but experimental in tenor. It's just as likely to sound boisterous, categorical, flat, extravagant, and above all, final. But would we want our thoughts venturing even into the well-marked precincts of public speech? Would we want those thoughts to be subject to the tightest possible moral oversight, scrutinized by a tribunal of unimpeachable judges who have been charged with the care and maintenance of intellectual probity across the society? So mindful a regime would require that all our preliminary thoughts remain, in prudence, tacit, unspoken, averse to experiment until they have been carefully rehearsed. But in that case, rehearsed before what audience? This situation is well known to proficient writers, almost all of whom learn much of what they mean as their work passes from a first to a final draft. As many of you may know, Samuel Johnson, the great English lexicographer and critic, saying, when you have written a sentence of your own which you think particularly fine, cross it out. composition teachers call this killing your darlings. This process of private thoughts passing toward public, seen in the form of revision of a draft by a writer, but it's the nature of experienced writers that they have learned to function as their own first audience when they revise the work before publication, an audience with unlimited veto power over superfluous words and posturing. But few people are like that in their approach to speaking up, even on a question where we're sure of our view and the contest is unavoidable. The sort of well-tempered orator who always seems prepared beforehand can also be tiresome. One feels that such a virtuoso has somehow missed the element of perpetual debut that has long characterized our popular culture. Ours, in America, is not a form of Republican life that mandates civic participation in many settings. A fact of mass suffrage democracy that is in some ways regrettable, but that also has its rewards, one of which should be an unapologetic protectiveness of the right of privacy. In consequence, many people first discover the depth of a given belief, or even the fact that they hold the belief, when they hear its opposite enunciated and find themselves saying no. We may say no at first to ourselves, but I think an early experiment or experience of saying no out loud is for many people their first intimation of intellectual or aesthetic self-knowledge. It can therefore be a starting point too for a kind of social knowledge that in more graduated or modulated tones will allow for involvement in public arguments that have more than one side. Arguments, I mean, in a mode of speaking and listening where it will be usual to hear sentences such as, "Why do you put it like that?" Or, "Can you remind me of the evidence?" This radical and self-formative power of hearing oneself say no, often for reasons one could hardly explain initially, seems to me elemental in our moral nature. It is just as vital to the growth of conscience as the act of willful disobedience, about which one is compelled to reflect afterward with thoughts about oneself that are not entirely pleasant. Even the most pointless, transgressive acts, if not immediately punished with a ferocity that aborts reflection, so angry at the punishment you forget what you did. Even the least defensible of such verbal acts can lead to thinking. A friend of mine once half shouted the word "fire" in a crowded room on a public occasion where the crowd had become already conscious of how absurdly they were crammed inside. It was, to repeat, a half shout only, 5 on a decibel scale of 10, and fortunately no one mistook his mock alarm for the real thing. But a slightly older man nearby glared black death at my friend. "You asshole." The chastisement from a random member of the public, which stopped short of formal public humiliation, made him think hard about a certain mischief in his makeup, a perverse impishness that he'd better work hard to rein in. Many teenagers, and I think especially teenage boys, have always said forbidden things aloud. Now they do it online, push themselves to risk a taboo expression and from a similar perverse motive. Will they take the dare and hurl themselves into the abyss of sheer transgression? The less overbearing the prodigals of punishment, I suspect, the more probably will the culprit accuse himself and learn from his temporary idiocy. The reform may always need the support of a modest group of charitable but disapproving peers. Conscience is the internalization of the making private a feeling that originated at a moment of embarrassment, exposure. It is never completely unrelated to embarrassment, I think, the origins of conscience. These intuitive and too seldom noticed points of ordinary psychology have shaped my thinking about the social media regime of surveillance, censorship, unconscious as well as voluntary self-censorship, and the organized humiliation of persons whose words stray outside the bounds of acceptable opinion. The new ethic of social control and behavioral discipline got started in the first decade of the 21st century, but it had clearly jumped forward at scale with the Tahrir Square protest in Egypt in 2011, a protest largely credited with having been arranged via social media up to the hundreds of thousands of persons. And by the time of the Me Too blacklists in 2017, it was impossible to estimate the limit of the power of social media and its potential repressive influence. Many varieties of crude and debased and vulgar speech and conduct have in this way been eliminated, or anyway pushed back toward invisibility, inaudibility. And no well-brought-up person will lament their departure from the scene. But there is a drawback. People who know they are being watched act differently than they act when left to themselves with no suspected eyes on them. The morale of a person or a self-selecting group is subtly dampened. The undefended word or gesture is quietly suppressed, and a thin layer of slightly numbing deference wraps itself around the scene of discussion or argument or just thoughtless diversion. To anyone in a position to compare these two climates, the difference is as detectable as a sudden change in the weather. A day that started off warm has turned tepid. You notice the syndrome easily enough in a classroom when a second teacher or a visiting parent or a distinguished colleague comes to observe. The familiar shorthand students are using with each other may not work for the new company, they think. It may be wise to lower your voice a bit, to say a little less and less pointedly. The depressing change grows unmistakable when the watchful eyes now include your classmates all the time, or new and uncertain friends, or friends of friends, who may take any partial verbal transcript as an opportunity to frame a picture around a few reported words or phrases. Words may be half meant at first and less than half understood. This sequence of speech, record, and almost instant transmission has by now been so normalized that it is hard to say whether the effect is always intended. But the effect, if not the intent of the reporter of the supposed infraction, is to dial back the eccentric or erring individual and make him or her conform again to the acceptable type. So I have ended my talk I've ended this talk by speaking of social media as you knew I would, and the tacit and in some measure paralyzing influence of social media on free inquiry in higher education, but also in many other social settings. Universities, I think, ought to take a particular stand against the dulling down of spirited conversation from the very presence of social media. They are a constant presence in the minds of most students and many teachers as a likely channel of reward or dangerous rebuke. It seems an interest of education, more broadly, to discountenance the use of signed or anonymous reports on the non-public utterances of other people. I think I'll repeat that sentence. It seems an interest of education broadly considered to discountenance the use of signed or anonymous reports on the non-public utterances of other people. The cost of having ignored for as long as we have this encumbrance of being watched without our permission and unkindly overheard has been a drastic reduction of the energetic contact between private thoughts and public speech, which is to say, a loss of the virtue of sincerity, without which all thought and all speech are worthless.
Yeah, so thank you so much, David. This was wonderful. So actually my first question picks up right on your conclusion, which is, what is the mission of universities in this particular climate, is in the age of social media, when social media are precisely in their very model, in their very design, social media are going against what the sort of candid self-restraint that you are advocating. And so what is universities can do in that regard? Do you think it's the mission of professors? Do you think it's the mission of administration? And in particular, because this is the field in which we both work, what is the specific mission of literary studies in that regard? Because I would say that literature classes are, among all classes, the classes where you should learn to speak honestly and honestly and with restraint, not because you fear the consequences, but because you want to be faithful to your own thought. So it seems to me that literature and literary studies are the field where you should do this sort of training, but I would love to hear your thoughts about this.
Yes, first I want to agree with, and more than that, affirm your way of putting the thought my talk was speaking for, and that is candid self-restraint as a virtue, because candor and self-restraint might not seem to go together. Candor is different from frankness, but it is etymologically linked with the blankness of white, and it also has an earlier 18th century English meaning of kindly, and that is to say, you take it initially charitably. The candid reader that Gibbon introduces his history to is meant to read the text charitably, even if offended by its infidelity. What should the university do? So I'm of the opinion that universities should not speak as persons about political and quasi-moral and sentimental issues which belong properly to persons and where persons may have different views from each other. So I think it's been a drastic detour, I hope, but going off the path they were on for some 50 years before, for American universities and others in the West, at least, as far as I can see, following America's example in this as in so much else, to be making announcements. We stand with so-and-so, such a group. We stand against so-and-so, an obvious thing that everybody's against, but by the university saying it, they suggest that this should be at the very top of your priorities in thinking about society right now, et cetera. But universities, I think in their nature, and those who administer universities, have to declare their interest in education. And if an issue is centrally about education, they should take a stand. It's not a sentimental, moral, or political stand in other respects, let alone taking a side in this or that social dispute. It seems to me that, I use the word discountenance because it's not, that was a twisty word. It's a dodgy word. That's probably why I used it. It doesn't mean prohibit the use of social media, but I think students should be made to feel low and stupid for wanting to use social media a lot. And I think that there could be, as a matter of the rights of students, the educational rights of students, rules against reporting on private conversations by other students. That's not to say that lots of silly things can't be said on social media, including gossip about teachers, gossip about lots of things. But this sort of Stasi approach inside universities, you're gonna do something to someone by reporting what they said and then making a snide comment on it. I think universities could go very far in discouraging that, in discountenancing it as a new custom that we think doesn't belong on this scene. Lots of workplaces have rules like that. You can't be a barista at Starbucks if you're drunk. You're drinking the wrong kind of thing. So that's a bad example. And in universities where, we are meant to be, thought to be encouraging thinking, the cult of the instant reaction, let alone the cult of the accusation and the unfounded slander, goes against thinking and goes against, the presumably honorable situation of the person who wants to state his or her thought. So I think they can't afford to take a position as an educational position of discouraging university-wide the use of social media about other people in the university. I think this simply is a counterpart of many teachers, including me, telling students to turn off their gizmos before class. And when you see somebody using it in class, calling it and saying, put that away. Why should that not come from the leaders of universities? Well, they have been made to shy away from their function by lots of bad experiences. These experiences of protests and renamings and disinvitations and all the rest, which everybody here probably has thought about on your own. As for literary study, I think that charity in translation, charity in interpretation seems of the essence of it. And one of the ways you set an example, but also help students learn what the free use of language is, which doesn't mean you approve of everything you read, old or new, is to show them how the meanings of words change and how meanings can be complex. For example, in teaching Chaucer, there's a word he uses in 2 or 3 of his bawdy tales in the Canterbury Tales. It corresponds to the modern word, sounds very like it, for female genitals. It starts with a Q instead of a C in Chaucer's version. And a lot of students coming across it think, this is a horrible, dirty word, and he's showing he's a misogynist. Well, there's a lot of other low language in Chaucer and low gestures that aren't exactly meant to be moralizing in that sense. And gradually, I think students can be accommodated to see it. Now, Chaucer's not going to be everybody's favorite poet in any case, but to, come across to this, 500-year-old author with a finger-wagging pride of a 21st century enlightened person is to despise the opportunity of education. So that goes with less obvious cases of changes in language too. The student who says about, an episode in a novel by Walter Scott, which, takes a chance at comedy in talking about one of the, Highland tribesmen. A student who says, this offends me, is not making a critical remark, is not making a remark that has any intellectual interest. And and there are ways of saying that to the student that are not a put down. You just say, well, maybe Scott's offended by you too, but that's not interesting. And so, again, there's a kind of humility and wanting to get to know the thing before you pronounce on it. So that, I agree that that's especially pertinent to what we do as classroom teachers in literature. But I think it's true for people who teach history of ideas or even history too, because custom is such a changing and adaptable thing, and people easily mistake the meanings of old customs unless they're told otherwise.
Absolutely. Yeah, another remark on the sort of a hygiene that we can, sort of moral hygiene that we could try to follow, especially in studying text. I remember in a previous conversation, you told me that you try to encourage students not to use some fashionable words, like I had the misfortune to use the verb weaponize when I was talking to you, and you told me, oh, that's a word you should not use. But I think it's a very smart rule.
So I was being a scold. All right, yeah.
Yeah, but it's a very smart rule. But on the other hand, it goes against, I guess, very common views currently on higher education, in which precisely you get an Ivy degree for your proficiency in this sort of, in in how quick you can pick up on this new language. So would you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, no, it's the new language gets to us. I'm unusually sensitive to it. Sort of, I get a skin reaction to new words a lot of the time, and a lot of the time wrongly, because things are added to our slang, or intellectual or other kinds of dialect all the time, and some of them are worthwhile, some of them last and then change. Dig it. Is that still an expression? I use it occasionally. Of course, it comes from dancing. You dig. And then it goes from there into jazz and so on. I think that's valuable. It would be valuable if it still meant the same thing. I use it sometimes. I don't know if my students get it. There's others that I would feel more divided about, like the word vibe. That's an interesting vibe. I'd want more specification. There's certain intuitive remarks, even in a classroom, where that might be a word that's in place. But when you find yourself using a current word, a very current word, I think it's always it's good to have that check and think, do I know exactly what I mean by this? Because if it's very current, what does weaponize mean? Weaponize means turn it into a kind of weapon. Well, what kind of weapon? So it's very common to hear now at this moment, this peculiar moment, when it tends to be conservatives who are for free speech and civil liberty, and people on the social justice left who are against free speech. This is new to somebody who grew up as I did in California in the 60s, when it was the opposite, very much the opposite. But when you hear that word weaponize, what does it mean? They've turned free speech into a weapon, so the speech is going to kill someone, or they're just taking, and of course, if you combine the First Amendment with the Second Amendment, it does mean that they can bring guns to speak. But that's not what most people mean when they say the right has weaponized free speech. It slows you down a little. I guess what I'm saying is it's always good to slow yourself down and just to start to hear what you're saying, which often takes, there's a shying away from your own meaning, which leads to circumlocution and not ever quite getting to the point. But there's also the shortcuts that new slang can offer that is very misleading. You think you know what it means. I became aware of this, for instance, early on when I was teaching at Princeton years ago, course, the freshman Shakespeare course. And I'd get a couple papers on Romeo and Juliet where the students say, Romeo and Juliet are experimenting with a different lifestyle. Well, lifestyle that's a 70s and 80s word maybe now. Now it's come into the language. I'm sure it translates a German word that's been in German for a longer time. But it is, Romeo and Juliet aren't experimenting with a lifestyle. They are in love in the middle of feuding families with very old customs, which they are partly loyal to, and that's the catch of the tragedy. So they're being able to use that fast word, though the students were just wanting to honor the youthfulness and the differentness of Romeo and Juliet. That was a shortcut I felt obliged to make them do a longer detour around.
Well, I think it's precisely our mission as educators and as educators in literature to make students do this kind of detours. So because of my field of expertise, I have to bring French literature in some way. So let me bring two things, one from the 18th and one from the 20th century. So it seems to me that your vision is quite close to what Marivaux, the 18th century playwright, is to what he's saying in his theoretical writings. He's making a very clear distinction between self-correction, when you're correcting your thought because you want to be faithful to your own thought. And he's using this sort of the painting metaphor. He's saying, language is like the pencil that's going to help you draw your thinking and show them to the public. So that's self-correction, which is very different from self-censorship, in which you're you're preventing yourself from saying something for fear of the consequences. So is that close to what you're...
Yeah, only the other part in my sketch of this psychology is the self-censorship of thought, not just of the passage of thoughts into speech, so that there are thoughts I don't permit myself to think. This would correspond to people saying, "I just don't want to go into that," but it means there's I don't know. I'm not coming up with a good example, but if there's a whole category of people or profession that you've been taught to regard with contempt, and there's a member of that lot who strikes you as in some way a good person, don't think too far into that. You can't afford to be seen smiling at that person. You can't afford to be seen shaking hands with that person. So you're not going to think about the fact that people with obviously wrong views, as you've been taught to understand, obviously, can nevertheless be complex to the point of being amiable, maybe even in some way admirable. No, just don't think that. So it leads to drawing boundaries around yourself and boundaries around your thought. I've only given an example involving the knowledge of character, but I think it has to do also with ideas, with even genres in the arts that you're taught to think this or that about.
So picking up on this question of character, I had another question involving the example of the group of French intellectuals who were brought to China during the Cultural Revolution, so including Bart, Kristeva, and the one I'm interested in is Roland Bart, who was brought to China during the Cultural Revolution, brought by the Chinese official to witness it. And we have his notebooks in which he understands very well what is going on. He's seeing how speech is restrained, and he's saying that he's disgusted by this. So we have that in his notebooks. But then when he came back to France, the article he wrote was a sort of harping on, a fantasy harping on the eternal Orient, saying how beautiful China was. So
it didn't exactly lie.
Yeah.
He just deviated.
Yeah, so is that restraint or cowardice?
Cowardice.
Okay, could you explain us why?
Well, the explanation of why, and a charitable explanation, is in a movie I like. I don't know if you do, I hope you do, which is Godard's movie La Chinoise, about a group of these. And I think Godard was not a man of ideas and politically became very fashionable left within months after making that movie. May not have known where he stood himself. But he got these young French actors with bits of script, the way he usually worked, talking about the events of 1968. The movie's made a little bit before that. And it includes the example of the most sober and, I suppose you would say, stiff and most intellectual of this lot of students living together in their little commune. Ends up being expelled from the group and alienated from them and meditating on that. But you feel that he still can't bear to break. And if he wrote anything, he would probably write something like Bart. But in this, as it were, spontaneous interview on camera, he confides about his discontents in the group and how it just couldn't work out. So I think, rather than speak of cowardice, though, I think it's more than a concept. I've seen it. As Mencken said about, most of you will know, H.L. Mencken was asked once if he believed in baptism, and his reply was, believe in it, I've seen it done. Same with cowardice. But I think it would be better to say that a chance at courage was neglected. But I think that's a very purposeful, he did a number. He didn't exactly tell lies. I think that kind of, walking around the subject when it's too hard to say it straight, the consequences. You don't want to face it. There can be many reasons for that. It's not just that you're afraid of political disapproval. I think many men of letters, I don't know enough about Bart to say this, but many men of letters, and not just French, are people who like to have friends. And many academics, and I started noticing this when the controversies over free speech really began to heat up in the early 90s, many academics are in the profession we're in because they want a quiet life. And they will tell you in private that, they feel the same thing that such and such person feels who's just put himself out on a limb, but it's not worth it. You'll get synonyms of that phrase a lot of the time. It's not worth it. So, there are many motives. Cowardice is maybe too brute an expression to cover everything, but let's just say it takes courage to come forward, and you want more people to have it. And you want students to have plenty of examples of it to see, so that at an early stage in a career, they're not made to feel that it's terribly risky to speak in earnest about something where they might be the only ones saying it. And of course, they're conscious of this. At least I feel this among Yale students who have confided in me somewhat. Given the pervasiveness of social media and how the message gets out, it can feel that you're doing palpable damage to your career by being heard saying a very wrong thing. So is it worth it? I have always been a loudmouth, but there's no doubt that writing a book that I wrote on education, which was controversial and got some doors closed on me and some doors slammed on me. But writing it after I had tenure was a prudent thing to do. And it's asking a lot of our students without help, without support from us to risk very much freshman year, sophomore year, and so on, where they feel that justified apprehensions.
Well, I have more questions in store, but maybe that's a very good way to move on to some questions. If anyone has a question.
Oh, you call on them.
Thank you.
Okay,
I guess one of the things that I don't hear, and I'm not sure if it's because I'm mistaken or it's fallen out of the discourse, but I have always believed that institutions of higher education have an implicit obligation to teach about the responsible uses of freedom. And that's what I don't really hear in the current debate. Am I being moralistic? Who would determine what is responsible or irresponsible? But I think that is different. To talk about a responsible use is different from talking about something that should be prohibited or should be encouraged. I think there's some kind of a judgment there that I would think educational institutions would want to cultivate in students. Can you comment or?
Yeah, I agree with what you said, and give me credit for my weasel word discountenance, not prohibit. But I don't think harm would come from universities saying we disapprove of the use of social media about your fellow students in a gossipy way that could be damaging, period. I don't think there's anything against that. Universities have lots of rules like that, not rules that don't exactly have reprimands attached to them. That's a minor suggestion. I think that the category we're talking about is the difference between censorship and disapproval. And I think, one's learning of what is responsible and irresponsible has something to do with what people you respect, institutions you have a reason to expect, let you know is what we don't do. That is disapproved of. That's not the same as setting penalties on the books or improvised penalties under committees of discipline for this or that spoken word or gesture that's like a word. But that is what seems to me to have been fading from the academic scene for a long time. And I think my student generation, not me, but my generation in general, of the 60s takes some of the blame for that, because I think their disapproval was uncool. Let them do what they do. And that ethic was conveyed upward to administrators, or the people who thought it about themselves eventually became administrators. But part of education, I think, is just learning. It's a piece of manners, but I think it has implications for freedom too. And again, it's not a matter of affixing punishments to this or that kind of thing that's said. Does that get your question?
Thank you. It's still, I think, slanted toward disapproval or prohibition or discouragement. I'm trying to get like a positive valuing of responsibility. What is responsible citizenship? What is responsible freedom of expression?
Give me an example of responsible expression. To express yourself responsibly.
I'm coming up blank. But I guess in terms of values that we would want to cultivate and encourage in a free society, so that would be things like respect for other people. How do we respectfully communicate? How do we respectfully disagree? How do we respectfully encourage or discourage?
I think a lot of people know that, and they fall foul of it when they become members of an episodic mob, and they forget their manners. Most of them are taught that. Most of the people at a place like Princeton or Yale are taught that by their parents. As for what the positive, adjectives or predicates of higher education would be, I mean, we have these mission statements now. They're full of that. They're not, I don't find them very inspiring, but they say the obvious things. Yale's motto is lux et veritas, light and truth, enlightenment, and that which includes candid self-restraint. But I don't know how much encouragement of that at the level of college an administration should be expected to do. I mean, I think the expectation should be that coming in, people have a pretty good idea what good manners is, and a good idea that, for example, using a lot of cuss words in the middle of a conversation which began as a legitimate political argument with two sides is just wrong. I think most students know it, but if they feel there's no restrictions being put on them by friends or teachers or in any other way, they'll take their full swing.
If I could follow up on this gentleman's question, does adherence to the protocols in a college or university regarding the exchange of ideas, could that be described as commitment to the moral enterprise of free inquiry? By which I mean, suppose a college or university invites somebody to give a lecture, and there's a group on student that's bitterly opposed to this person's views. They shout the person down. From the standpoint of the protocols of a college or university regarding the free exchange of ideas, could we describe that as immoral?
It's anti-educational and against the morale, if you will, French idea, of this institution. So, I mean, it's just, you don't do it here, and you're not going to get away with it. Now, civil disobedience is different. Students who want to protest a speaker, they sit down and they agree to be arrested, and they spend one night in jail. Their parents bail them out. There's no big penalty beyond that, but they don't get to stop the speaker. That's what a university could be like. There are many students at various places. I was talking about this with a friend just this afternoon, who've been asking to get academic credit for activist engagement, including things like sit-ins and so on. That just seems to me taking two different things and saying they're really the same. So, I mean, free inquiry, and I like that way of putting it, as what is central to a university, that comes from Dewey. I think that requires that speakers be heard. It also requires, or should, that a self-respecting invited speaker wants to answer contentious questions that are put nevertheless in a polite sentence form. That happens, and any speaker who's unwilling to take that, in my opinion, is depreciated in his value as a speaker, and that should come to be known as part of that speaker's reputation. Oh, okay, he'll put across his views, but he doesn't believe in them strongly enough to defend them. So maybe he doesn't belong in a university, but in a Rotarian organization of some sort.
Thank you.
There was a question in the background.
It seems to me that a fundamental difference between what we're seeing in social media and what we see in the more public world is the use of evidence. The social media world is filled with opinion and idea and so on, but you don't see arguments. I mean, formal arguments or efforts at being detracting people with evidence. Now, it would seem to me that the various professors who get canceled for one reason or another have opinions that should be defended, and evidence should be provided, and there should be someone else who's countering that opinion. So rather than inviting a single speaker, you invite a debate. You have a debate, and the educational institutions would see this is a wonderful opportunity to apply the evidence. So rather than setting them up as single views that might be controversial or whatever, set it up as a debate. Educational institutions ought to adopt that model, it seems to me.
I think there should be more debate, more honest, but thoroughgoing, hard-driving, contentious debate than there is. I don't know that it needs to be the all-important format, and it's been used selectively. That's one of the problems. I mean, there's a recent story about a young black intellectual named Coleman Hughes. Some of you may have read him. Writes very well. A recent graduate of Columbia as a philosophy major, and he's written a book in defense of the Martin Luther King civil rights idea of color blindness. He did a TED talk on this theme. And the TED organization, after a lot of internal troubles, decided that they would play his talk, but there had to be an opposing point of view. Well, they don't normally require opposing point of views. So the debate format itself can show what the prejudices that the sponsors of an event want to have carry across. What's clear to me, I think, is a university that sees itself as primarily intellectual, secular, and founded on free inquiry. So this leaves out denominational schools or academies for a certain kind of social project. But a university like this, should want to exhibit all points of view and to make sure that views that have that are associated with speakers, authorities, scholars that use evidence, that there's a certain number of such speakers invited. There shouldn't be a quota, but if it's noticed that, and I'm let's call me an independent now, like 41% of Americans, but I've been a Democrat almost all my voting life, and there's no doubt that most people who end up in universities are Democrats, and that the Democrats are now, as somebody once recently called them, the party of the college educated. Nevertheless, there are Republicans who have thoughts that can be conveyed in words suitable to a university setting. Some of them are even scholars, and if a university were to find that in the last year campus-wide, let's say there have been 43 speakers who are clearly left or center-left in their politics, and one who has any other kind of politics, that's something the university could think of trying to balance, just for the hell of it, just because students might want to learn that there's other things in the world and why it is that they live in a country where one party is 50+% and the other party is in the high 40s%. That's a lot of the country on the other side. So how a university makes these calculations, I don't know. They can be said to be educational, I think, just as a part of diversity. The okay conservative word for this is viewpoint diversity. But that's certainly a value as much as cultural or ethnic diversity could be.
Any other questions? Yes, the gentleman, and then.
Thank you for your talk. I'm just wondering, like, in the real world, does the quality of your speech mean anything except when money, power, and prestige and position is at stake? And I'm thinking of what happened to the two college presidents that had to resign because of their statements they made at Harvard, I think the University of Pennsylvania, and what DeSantis tried to do or did to Disney. So does speech really matter unless there's something at stake that's real? You know, I take your point, like thinking well is a great thing, and you should really think before you speak, but most people's speech doesn't matter unless there's something to lose or something in the end.
I'm not sure.
Sure what I mean?
Understand the criticism.
Well, I guess we'll focus on what do you think of the presidents of Harvard and University of Pennsylvania having to resign because of their speech?
Well, I think the presidents of Harvard, Pennsylvania, and MIT were all in rather stiff and lawyer-like language saying the right thing about free speech. The peculiarity of that moment when the New York congressperson, what's her name, Elise Stefanik, demagogued them and shouted at them questions that they somehow didn't expect to come in that violent form. The surprising thing about it was that they were not, as university presidents, they were not able to think on their feet and explain that what they were doing was defending free speech for both sides. So when they spoke of, it depends on the context, about even the exhortation to genocide. Remember, that was what came up. They kept repeating the same phrase. That is context dependent. It was machine-like, context dependent. It turns out, if you read the New York Times story on this, they lawyered up before this hearing, and they were all counseled by the law firm Wilmer Hale. So that phrase came from the same lawyers to all three university presidents. And as an example of uniformity not being the same as diversity, that was pretty telling. But the fact is they were taking the right position, but they were unable to defend it. And there were different causes, as I understand it. Well, I think, no, clearly were different causes for the resignation of the UPenn and the Harvard president. With the president of University of Pennsylvania, there was a large donor protest, and it ended up being about money. But the incompetence of the performance had something to do with it. In the case of the Harvard president, discovered plagiarisms in some quantity actually ended up being so, what to say, against so far against people's idea of what a university president should exemplify, that her basis for staying there seemed to be pulled out from under her in spite of a great deal of faculty support. So I don't, both of those two cases are different from each other. Again, knowing what I know about the situation of free speech in universities, the weirdness of what happened there was that both Penn and Harvard had a very poor record on free speech in the years leading up to this confrontation in Congress. It's not just about the fact that Jewish students were made to feel intimidated by the sudden, united reaction of many other student groups right after October 7th, the sort of bewildering consensus of jeering against the Jewish victims on October 7th. But it's that these universities had taken a great many political stands in the past and had done it in a way that was prejudicial against one side and in favor of the other side. So they were not good on free speech, but nevertheless, with the spotlight on them, they said the right thing. But of course, they were trying to think it for the first time, and they couldn't think very clearly. I mean, so, was it a bad development in our public culture? Oh, yes, it was the opposite of educational. But people who can't think clearly like that in public, it is a question, who do you want as a university president? That's not just any job. So the whole situation is it's an American comedy, and it's to say a phrase my younger son always used to use, pretty messed up.
There was a question here, and then Eric.
Thank you. I had a question about the relationship between charity and sincerity. So I think, and tell me if I'm misrepresenting you, but I think I agree with with one upshot of the talk, which is that for an intellectual endeavor, charity is especially important. But I sometimes feel myself worried or maybe divided over the idea of being committed always to charity in an environment where there are a lot of actors or interlocutors, what have you, who are trying to be insincere, who are maybe not playing the sort of normal sort of intellectual endeavor, let's share reasons, let's do this kind of game. I worry that charity, while extremely valuable and important, depends on sincerity. I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate here because it's something I worry about, but I'd like to hear your response.
Can you give me an example of somebody who's abusing the charity they count on receiving, and whom you would feel backwards about confronting because you want to be charitable? Is there an example of that, a certain political scene?
Yeah, so I think you could find examples on both sides of the political spectrum.
Just give me one.
I know I feel bad. I guess I would think of, what's his name? Someone who, oh no, I'm blanking on his name. Usually shouted down.
Milan Yiannopoulos.
Yeah, sorry. Actually, that is exactly what I was thinking of. That's so funny.
I read more of this trash than you do. Yeah.
Sorry, but yeah. So someone like him, I think you could sometimes encourage some political actors on both sides of engaging in this kind of argument, where it's so instrumentalized. Sorry.
You're talking about these are showmen.
Yeah,
but why would you? They're in it for sort of the laughs, the applause. I don't. By charitable, I don't mean. I mean, he's the people who are provocateurs in this way. They are saying what they mean. It's just that they may say deliberately exaggerated and contradictory things. So they don't have a great deal of weight or value as artists of persuasion. And in a sense, there's not much point in trying to confront them or be a polite disputant in opposition to them. But you lose nothing, even if they're loutish and uncouth. You lose nothing by being more polite than they are. This is what is part of political skill, is politique, politesse. I mean, they're all related. And it's an example I like to use. It's not quite on the point, but I'll do it anyway. Deflection, which can be not impolite when you feel like being impolite. So the greatest thinking on his feet politician of my lifetime was Mario Cuomo, father of Andrew Cuomo, and who used to run a radio show in his later days as governor. He was debating his rival in the contest for the governorship of New York, Lou Lehrman, who's a pharmaceutical owner, I think, also donor to charities, including the Yale Center for Study of Slavery. So he's, mixed character. But they came to the debate, Cuomo looking stiff, dressed in gray, a political outfit, and Lehrman looking a little more upmarket and colorful and so on, like a rich guy who knows what kind of cufflinks to wear. Cuomo was going on a little too long, as often happened. He was a good speaker, but he liked to speak. And at some point, very visibly and rudely, because the camera took them in, a medium shot all the way through, Lehrman looks at his watch. And Cuomo says, "That's a very expensive watch, Lou." That could be done to Milan Yiannopoulos or whoever. That's taking them at their own speed without being, without lowering the level of everything. But I don't imagine if serious discussion is what you want, that engagement with a provocateur has much percentage in it. The point is, even those people, even if they're saying outrageous and borderline jailable things, shouldn't be shouted down. The argument, a silly, horrible, empty, sophistical argument some of these young protesters have begun to use is, we're taking advantage of the right to speak freely too. This is free speech, our shouting. I mean, that, a situation of free inquiry and open debate becomes intolerable where people start using justifications like that.
Eric.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is a historical question. I think it's maybe more, can you give me more insight into your psychology of self-censorship? Because I'm always struck at the surveys that Princeton students, especially conservative students, suggest that the strong majorities of them feel like as if they have to self-censor their speech, even in the classroom. No one is shouted down at Princeton. It's difficult for me to imagine faculty downgrading somebody for their beliefs. I've shamed some of my colleagues where I've sensed that possibility.
Why did you have to do that?
Why did I have to do that?
Why did you have to shame your colleagues where you sensed the possibility that they might grade students down because they were conservative?
Well, I'm not sure they would have graded them down, but they made an off-the-cuff private remark about a student's religious identity.
There you go.
But it doesn't happen often. So why do you think this has grown, that students feel timid?
I think.
What is the psych? It just seems we have so many outspoken conservatives.
We're not talking about self-censorship of thought in the outspoken conservatives, or even the conservatives who know that they are being prudent for the sake of their future careers. So that's a different analysis from what I meant by self-censorship of thought. But just as a matter of fact, you said it was a historical question. Yes, if I were a student now with my favorite political texts are works by Fanon and Angela Davis. I think that I'll feel free to say everything that I want to say about many political issues. If I'm a conservative whose favorite books are,
Burke.
Recent conservative literature is to be a fairer, and there isn't much of it that's much good. But something by William Buckley. What's his book on God and Man at Yale? The student is inspired by God and Man at Yale because the student is religious and feels that religion has always been pushed to the side by liberalism. That student, let's suppose on an impossible kind of measure of comparison that they're both bright, sensitive, use language well, etc. That second student is going to feel, less tempted to speak up in many conversation situations than the first student is. I think that's the way the climate feels to students at universities. I agree with you that professors, for the most part, that such as I feel that I know, don't grade down students for conservative opinions, but they don't hear many expressed in class. And they don't tempt students by expressing a conservative opinion very often themselves, because they want to be seen as good people, and good people would never be misunderstood so as to be seen to have a conservative opinion. I mean, I think that syndrome is at work, and I won't call it cowardice, but it is a kind of conformity, and I think it sets a bad example for students. So I mean, myself, I try to say things that make students very unsure of what my politics are.
But I think that, at least at Princeton, anecdotally represents the culture, yet the conservative students, 70% of them say they have to self-censor. I'm wondering if they come here with that, if it's in the broader, it's the way coverage of the institutions are.
If Princeton has a culture in the social sciences and the humanities such that most teachers keep their students off balance and quite uncertain of what their politics are, it is a great culture and there's nothing to be reformed about it. It would seem unlikely from what we learn from surveys by, what's that organization, FIRE, found it,
Yeah.
and others such. And as far as I know, those are reliable surveys. They are evidence. So I don't know how to counteract the students, how to compare the students' impression of their environment with your impression of the environment. They can't both be right. Both may have exaggerations favorable to something.
Greg has a question.
Well, I mean, to Eric's question, in the age of great inflation, it's hard to downgrade anyone anyway. So I would never be tempted myself to do that. But I think the obvious answer to his point is that they're afraid of the other students. They're not afraid of professors anymore, and they're afraid of students, to what you said, taking university speech out of its context and putting it on the internet. That is what they're afraid of. And honestly, they should be afraid of that. It makes complete sense that they would be afraid of it. The problem is that the university does not take an appropriate stand. I've said university should have a Chatham House rule. You should not be able to identify anything that your fellow students say in an academic setting, at least, and maybe in all settings on campus, for the sake of doing them some kind of professional harm. And I think the trouble here is just that the university fails to set itself apart from the rest of the social media culture. And I think that's what students are afraid of. It makes intuitive sense that that's what they're afraid of. It's also what they tell you they're afraid of. And it's also why the problem is intractable at the level of the individual professor. All right? Even if I were to give students an absolute assurance that I would never hold it against them if they expressed an unpopular opinion, maybe I'd even give them some bonus points for the effort. That's just not, I can't guarantee that the 13 other students in the precept won't, in a moment of malevolence or something, post something online. And so I do see that as the great, that is the great challenge, I think. And I think that's the psychology that not just students have, but also professors have. I always remember that when we had to go on Zoom, a very good friend of mine who is as orthodox a lefty as there is, but whose area of specialty touches on sensitive topics, told me that he thought his career would be over because of people just recording these things on Zoom and then cutting out snippets and whatever. And so, it's certainly not just students, but also faculty, I think, who feel this. And the university needs to set the example of just simply not responding when people call for harm to other students or faculty on the basis of what they say. And, that's where you've got to begin. But I think the psychology is, when we consider that it's not just the immediate classroom they're concerned about, but the whole world, and it's difficult to convince students that they can just speak to the classroom, I think the problem becomes a bit more evident. Anyway, that was kind of sermonizing for a bit, but I guess my question is, am I correct?
You just, no, I mean, you just put in italics something I was saying only in Roman print at the very end, and I agree with it, and I think the practical inference from it is just as you say, that universities have to build protections against the misuse, the slander by misuse out of context of some students' words by other students. It can happen not just taking from moments in class to being done silently by stealth or taking it from conversation student to student. It can happen in class in a kind of ganging up situation. I know of an instance of this that was told to me by a student in a Spanish language class, intermediate, I think, taught by a quite young professor, where they were reading from a text about decolonization, and there were a mixture of graduate students and undergraduates who were, very keen social justice believers, and they attacked one of these students for reading the part of an indigenous person, even though it was assigned to her by the teacher, and then attacked the teacher for assigning the text in such a way that white students read the parts of indigenous students, and threatened to go to the university newspaper where they could probably have found maybe one reporter who was willing to make a story out of it. That is an absurd situation. But as I know from the anecdote from a student I trusted, it reduced the teacher to tears. A young teacher whose job might be on the line. So, you just can't have this. You can't have that going on at all, any more than you can have, a speaker with unpopular views in this milieu being shouted down. So no, I agree completely.
Yeah, maybe a very quick comment. You don't have to answer that, but my question is, a question or comment would be, is this only a moral problem or is this an economic problem? And I'm wondering if the current economic model of the universities can allow them to really take a stance.
Yeah, well, that's another family member, now a lawyer in my family, has said this all along. When I started writing, I wrote an article called "The New Censors on Campus" in 7 years ago now, in the Chronicle of Higher Education. And he said, it's all about the student as consumer. That's really all it is. The universities dare not defy the prerogative, the sacred prerogative of the student as consumer. And if students feel they can use, let's say at some benign and picturesque and climate-wise a favorable campus like Stanford, just for example, they find that they can use all the social media they want there, but Princeton won't let them. Princeton, which has been called at times, maybe it isn't anymore, Stanford East. But Princeton, you can't use these social media. Well, there's going to be people on the ruling corporation at Princeton, people in the administration who say we can't afford to take the loss of students we're competing for. Same with Harvard, Yale, Chicago, Berkeley, all these comparisons. If one administration takes a strong stand against it, they'll feel they're losing out some of the students who, after all, have these habits which educationally we might think are bad habits, but who knows? Look, I have a friend so-and-so who uses it and says he gets a lot out of it. I have a friend so-and-so who, uses Twitter now, X, but he only looks at sites that have evidence, they link to evidence. This can be done too, it's a new form of scholarship. And in fact, for better or for worse, I just think for worse even there, but in journalism, social media has become unavoidable. One of the really rotten things that have ensued from its universal use now is that, for example, at a political speech, you'll get members of the media from all the different, media outlets, including network TV, cable TV, all the rest, live blogging the speech on their Twitter. They do it all at the same time. And if you think about it, well, that's an example of free speech, and it makes sure that everybody gets the facts right away. But it induces a whole new kind of conformity because they see what each other are saying. And even if they disagree with each other, a far right and a far left cable station, for example, they see what the other regards as important. So even when it doesn't determine conformity of point of view, it narrows down the subject matter. Oh, this is the important thing to talk about. Right now, the whole of the United States in the respectable media are talking about the prison death of Navalny, the Russian dissident. That's been front page news for a week on all sides. It's important and it's terrible and it should be talked about. But should that be talked about by everybody for a week in the United States? And it has to do with this reflecting this hall of mirrors that social media create, along with the collapse of time. I mean, everything happening instant and therefore fast and therefore short. Oh, time.
Maybe we have do we have time for one more question?
Always, I insist.
I'll get to talk to David. So what I'll do is I'll just end with the anecdote that you talked about students. Is when I was an undergraduate, I had a tutor and I was a student representative. There's this kind of student-faculty council. Students could go to the faculty and say, we want these kinds of courses, that kinds of courses. And at one point, this faculty member turned to us and chided us and says, if you are going to use market metaphors in a university, you should remember you are the product, not the consumer.
Well,
That's Mario Savio said it in similar language in his Rage Against the Machine speech.
Okay, well, that was a great note to end on. I want to thank the James Madison Program Initiative on Free Speech for hosting the event, and let's thank Professors Bromwich and Champy again.